Hello, this is the lecture video for Module 5, Differential Impacts, Vulnerability, and Preparedness by Population, Location, and Demographic Factors of Sci 333E, Psychology of Disaster and Climate Change at the University of Maine at Augusta. Now this module should take you about 3 weeks to complete. The due date is midnight, November 27th, 2016, and we are going to be covering two major topics within this video, or within this module. So the first topic is going to be country and regional disparities. And so think about global demographics, geography, politics, ethnicity, poverty, all sorts of things, not just within country, but also on the global scale. The two readings that we have for this are first a chapter that I wrote that is in press. Actually, it should be coming out now-ish, anytime. And the chapter is called Psychological Impacts of Climate Change on Marginalized Groups. It's in Social Issues in Living Color, Challenges and Solutions from the Perspective of Ethnic Minority Psychology. This book is going to cover a wide variety of topics, and here I have the climate change topic. And then also our second reading for this topic is Pender-Hughes, 1996, The Impact of Race on Environmental Quality, an Empirical and Theoretical Discussion. Our second topic is going to be women, children, and the elderly. These three categories, demographic categories, are oftentimes put together, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is. Our two major readings for this section is going to be UNICEF 2015, Unless We Act Now, The Impact of Climate Change on Children, and the UN Women Watch fact sheet, Women, Gender Equality, and Climate Change. My chapter that we have you reading this week is The Psychological Impact of Climate Change on Marginalized Groups. It will be published probably next year in a book called Social Issues in Living Color. I was actually recommended to author this chapter by Dr. Janet Swim, who was the lead author of the APA climate change book that we read a couple of weeks ago. Now, because this chapter is not yet published, what you have is a working draft, and it may change before the final publication is out, so I'm asking that you don't share it beyond our class. This chapter is about 20 pages long, and here is what you are going to see in it. First, an orientation to the reader. Why are psychologists interested in climate change? We've been talking about this a lot, and so I'm hoping that these first few pages are pretty obvious to you. Next, I discuss marginalization on a global scale and what it really means to have or not have power in our world. This leads us into issues surrounding human and environmental rights and justice. Because people in our world have different levels of decision-making power, different levels of access to resources, and therefore bear the burdens of those decisions differently, we have to consider environmental rights and justice within the context of human rights and justice, especially within the psychology of climate change. We already have a long history of disparity in this world, and we can expect and are already seeing that climate change is going to exacerbate this disparity. So I spent quite a few pages discussing the different types of disparity and impacts, including physical, social, and psychological impacts within climate change. The second half of the paper really deals with what do we do about it? The role of psychologists, and in fact I would say the role of most climate change researchers, if not all climate change researchers, is to first identify what exactly is the problem and then identify what can we do now. For example, we have discussed how climate change is not a new concept, but given that we as a world have known about this for a number of decades, why aren't we taking more action to solve it? These barriers are rooted in our lives that we lead and also in our psychological conceptions of reality. Our cognitions, our thoughts, our emotions, our choices that we make, these cognitions lead to action or inaction in a personal, individual sense, as well as on a community and societal level. Now, you'll be familiar at this point with the theory of the psychological sense of place because I discussed it within my Tuvalu research. In this chapter, I also give you an overview of some of the other research that has been done within the theory, within climate change, and how it influences our climate change actions as well as our physical and psychological health and well-being. Finally, the last few pages talk about some of the really great actions that are happening in the developing world. We've talked a lot about how some populations, particularly poor and minority populations, are disproportionately impacted by climate change and disaster. Well, perhaps because they are living within this reality, they're working on solutions. So, for example, development is an ongoing justice issue. It's an ongoing issue that people are working on in the developing world. We have justice and health and economic issues within developing these nations. But a lot of people are beginning to reconceptualize development away from our Western model of unlimited growth and expansion and the inherent disparity that this creates. This allows us to take justice seriously within development, but it also allows us to plan for climate change and environmental sustainability within our new reconceptualizations of development. Many indigenous communities worldwide also have really great models for adaptation to environmental changes, given that their cultures and traditions are predicated on ongoing changes. One of my favorite examples of this is the LMMA, or Locally Managed Marine Area Programs. These are sites that are spread out over Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands region, and they allow for a network of action sites that can share information and lessons learned, but they are very much locally based. Each site develops its own plans and priorities for managing a marine area and increasing its ecological health and sustainability. They blend marine and coastal sciences with local values, cultures, traditions, and beliefs to create priorities and actions that will benefit the land, benefit the culture, benefit the community, and ultimately will be sustainable because they're not imposed from an outside source. They are created within the site in which they exist. However, they're still networked with each other, and so they can share lessons learned, they can share what has worked, what has not worked, they can share the science that they are developing and they are creating, and decide if these things can be adapted into other communities, if they can be changed to fit within the local culture and the local needs, or if they're, maybe not useful for this particular area. It's a terrific blend of physical sciences, social sciences, culture, history, indigenous knowledge, community values, and the goal is sustainability in the widest possible sense. That would be environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, cultural sustainability, community health and longevity, all of these different things. The Pender-Hughes chapter, The Impact of Race on Environmental Quality, explores the reality of these disparities. As a warning, many students I've had, and I'll include myself in this group to be honest, find this chapter to be deeply disturbing. Like I said, the disparity of existence around race and social class are so deeply tied to the structure of our society that, number one, even with all of the great strides that we've taken in the past 50 or so years, they still exist. Remember, removing the intent of discrimination is not on its own sufficient to removing the reality of discrimination. And number two, for people who are not the victims of this discrimination, it's largely invisible. That is to say, white people and people who do not live in poverty are less likely to personally experience the impacts of this disparity, and so it's less likely to be part of their lived reality in their daily lives. Since most people don't spend their day-to-day lives thinking, oh, I want to create environmental devastation in communities of poor and brown people. Most people are largely unaware that such environmental devastation exists. There is not the intent, and so the disparity continues to occur unintentionally, and in many cases, invisibly. Reading about the realities of the disparity that exists in our country is disturbing. People may want to deny that it could possibly be real because, again, it's outside of their own lived experience. And people may want to look for someone to blame, but again, the structures that cause this are old and are institutionalized, meaning that they are deeply interwoven into the fabric of society. It's not like there's this one guy out there somewhere, and if we could change his mind, we could fix everything. These issues are deep and pervasive. Pinderhughes begins the chapter by providing an overview of this reality, making it visible. Case after case after case of environmental disparity, of toxic waste sites placed in poor and minority communities, pollutions heaped upon indigenous populations, physical and health impacts disproportionately experienced by poor people and by ethnic and racial minorities in our country. Pinderhughes explores study after study, report after report, finding that those in our country who have less power and less access to resources will experience more discrimination in the form of living in dangerous, polluted, and chemically toxic environments. And again, those who have more power and more access to resources get to exert that power and say, not in my backyard. Their issues are addressed and the environmental devastation disappears from their sight, from their reality, pushed into locations that are homes to people without the same power, and thus it becomes invisible. Pinderhughes discusses the theoretical and historical backgrounds that create this disparate reality, discusses the extent to which the discrimination is institutionalized and therefore continues to operate as part of the status quo, with or without intention by any particular member or leader of society. But finally, Pinderhughes closes the chapter by reviewing the environmental justice movement. As I said, we can remove the intent of discrimination from our system, but the system will continue to operate with discrimination. However, we can intentionally change the system to operate differently. And that is the point of the environmental justice movement. First, to recognize that we do not live the same reality. We live different realities based on who we are within a society. We need to recognize this disparity, this discrimination, recognize the polluted environments and health impacts and the devastation that exists in the lives of the poor minority people in our society. So first, the environmental justice movement makes the invisible visible. Second, we must take action to change it. Action by action, policy by policy, piece by piece. Pinderhughes reports the actions that are being intentionally taken to remove discrimination from the system and to make it far safer and healthier and sustainable for all communities and all environments. After seeing, and sometimes for the first time, the disparity that exists in our country, it's freeing to realize that others see it too and are doing something about it, and we can as well. And so let's bring it back to climate change. The disparity that exists between populations in the United States and around the world is not new. It is deeply ingrained into the structures and power and economy within the world. And to many, including many of those who are in power and who make decisions regarding climate change actions, this disparity is invisible. We as professionals who work in disaster and climate change issues must see it, we must bring it to light, and we must prepare for it within mind. Actions for mitigation to reduce the climate changes must be made by those who have the power to act, even when developing nations are unable to match those actions because they can't afford to. Actions for adaptation to prepare societies so that as the changes occur, we can continue to function and thrive as a society. These actions for adaptation must be made with the understanding that some people are more vulnerable than other people. We do not prepare only the wealthiest members of our society to keep them safe from disaster, to keep them safe from blizzards. We have to prepare the entire society, and therefore we have to see the different lived realities. And finally, we've mentioned development a few times in this class. Developing nations are in a continual process of growth to meet the needs of their people. When infrastructure and education and food and water systems, healthcare, and every other social structure is being developed, it must be funded to support climate changes that will occur and to protect people within the society at all levels of vulnerability, at all levels of power. Actions must be taken with intention. We cannot be blinded to the realities of those who are most vulnerable within the society, and so that's that first step within the environmental justice movement, including within the climate change research and action movements. So for our topic on women, children, and the elderly, we have two readings. First is Unless We Act Now, the Impact of Climate Change on Children, which is a report from UNICEF, or the United Nations Children's Fund. I can hear the groans as you open the file and realize that it's 84 pages long, but please do not collapse into despair. First of all, I will direct you to pay particular attention to the summary section, such as the foreword, the key messages, the introduction section that kind of cover all of the topics in brief, so focus in on those. And then I am going to direct your attention to the fact that much of this report is actually constructed in very handy infographics, illustrative images, as well as descriptive reporting. And of course, I will instruct you, as always, to consider the course requirements that I want you to pay particular attention to topics that align closely with your professional and academic development and spend less time focusing in on topics that don't quite align with your field of interest. But honestly, this is such a great and readable report that I can almost guarantee you that you will get sucked in and read more and more deeply than you set out to. It is a compelling read, it is important, and so you may want to do yourself the favor of giving yourself the gift of time in order to spend more time with this reading, just because it is going to draw you in. Children suffer the effects of climate change disproportionately due to the fact that they have very little power in societies. Like women and the elderly, they suffer disproportionate issues with poverty and food and housing insecurity. And in addition, they are reliant on adults for care. In the cases of disasters, they are reliant on adults for planning and preparation and response and recovery actions. In terms of climate change, they are reliant on adult actions toward adaptation and mitigation, and then of course where climate change and disasters intersect, they're again reliant on adults for these intersections. This report explores children's risk globally regarding a few key issues associated with climate change. This includes chapters on drought and water stress, on floods and severe storms, and of course remember that some regions are experiencing both drought and floods alternately, and that this is exacerbated by climate change so that we have more severe drought as well as more severe flood. There is a chapter on heat stress and air pollution and diseases, all of which children have disproportionate impact to, in addition to elderly have disproportionate impact of heat stress, pollution, and diseases. And there's also one key chapter, and this is very key for the developing bodies and brains of children, which is the impact of cumulative shock and stress. Each additional stressor or risk factor that accumulates in a child's life greatly increases their total risk for negative outcomes throughout their entire lifespan. High numbers of risk factors that are not mitigated with community supports or other protective factors that kind of mitigate those risk factors, these risk factors will build on each other and they can cause very poor outcomes throughout adolescence and adulthood. Chapter 7 of the UNICEF report also discusses the long-term consequences of various plans of action for climate change. So using 3 different scenarios, and you'll remember these scenarios from the book Climate Changed and from the IPCC reports, UNICEF focuses in on how our different plans of action will significantly specifically impact children on into our future. And finally, UNICEF identifies a climate change agenda for children that this organization supports in order to reduce impacts and hopefully avoid some of the worst possible impacts to the world's children. We also have a fact sheet from UN Women Watch called Women, Gender Equality, and Climate Change. You'll notice as you read through this fact sheet, which is much shorter than the UNICEF report, that many of these issues overlap with the UNICEF report, so they'll be familiar to you as you come to them. And there's a reason for this. Globally, women are still primarily responsible for the care of children and the elderly. This, coupled with the reality that women are more likely to experience poverty, undereducation, and underemployment than men, means that women still remain a socioeconomically disadvantaged group worldwide, and oftentimes their lives are very much interconnected with the lives of children and elderly within societies, and so their vulnerabilities overlap with each other greatly. That being said, it is also true that worldwide, women play extraordinarily powerful roles in societies. Oftentimes, women are the primary purveyors of culture. They teach children how to be adults, how to be good adults in society, how to grow up to be men and women and responsible, and etc., etc. They organize family and community gatherings. They may or may not lead spiritual rituals, but they often organize them and make them run, make them happen. The same with government and economies. Women's work makes community happen. It keeps society functioning, and it informs society of who it is. For all of these reasons, it is essential that women are considered in and included in planning for climate change, be it dealing with issues of food security or biodiversity, water, health, technology, etc., etc. All of these issues that are covered in this fact sheet, women are disproportionately impacted by these issues within disaster events and within climate change threats. But also, women can and do play key roles in educating communities and making change that helps society mitigate and adapt to climate change, dealing with these exact same issues. They are the purveyors of culture, and they make these things happen, and we see this worldwide. Now, your assignments for this week are, within your reading reflection, I want you to answer the following questions. Describe at least 5 ways each in which minorities, children, and women are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So 5 ways that minorities, 5 ways that children, and 5 ways that women are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I want you to describe why are some populations more vulnerable than other populations. And here, give me a thoughtful answer. I want to know what you have learned from this chapter about why there is such disparity within our vulnerabilities across the world and across societies, and even within societies. Why are some populations more vulnerable than others? Tell me what you've learned. Also, what are your thoughts on how we can reduce this disparity of impact? For your applying the terminology to real life scenario, I have a link to a PBS NewsHour report about how one of the major contributors to the Syrian conflict has actually been climate change. We have seen kind of a political instability, but that was greatly exacerbated by environmental instability and things that were happening due to climate change. I want you to read this and then just tell me what you think about how the world can and should respond to populations that are made vulnerable by climate change and that are made vulnerable by political issues that are then exacerbated by climate change. There's no one answer to this. There's no right answer to this. Just tell me what you think given everything that you've learned so far. That's what we have for this module. Please let me know if you have any thoughts or questions, and as always, I look forward to hearing from you.